Tonight is particularly special. I mean, every night is special, but for me, this is personally special. I think I met you guys, I was saying earlier, about 20 years ago when you probably met each other. So we're just 1 year off a 20-year anniversary. And today I sat down and refreshed my memory over this book, which charts those nearly 2 decades, well, say 17 years or 16, 17 years of practice that feels like it came out of a happy accident of friends who wanted to do something else, who wanted to approach practice or really making or creating opportunities in a different way. And I seem to remember one thing led to another, and here you are now. But that rather shortens quite a complex story full of complex individuals, which I had the privilege to know, and I feel that many of you haven't changed at all. And I think that's very much for the better. But I remember them all being really, really distinct characters. This is not necessarily a meeting of equal personalities. You know, there's a complete spectrum of ways of operating, and to see that come together into collaborative practice that still holds the kind of the voice of the individual is perhaps an extraordinary thing, but also always, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, can have its issues and problems. But it's also, I think, quite unique. It's really hard to hold a band of people together. It's really hard to kind of hold the fiction of your collaboration together. And I think what's fascinating, I'm curious to hear more about, is the way in which that story shifts and changes over really quite a considerable period of time. And then, of course, what is next? So I'll hand over to you, Maria, Anthony. Welcome.
Thank you. Is my mic working?
Hello.
Thanks, Ingrid. Thanks to AA hosting us. Like similarly, it's quite amazing to be here. As Ingrid just said, so we met as Ingrid was a lot of our first year tutor at Cambridge. She was a couple of members DOS at King's. I think there's like a few key figures within like Cambridge that really I think are actually hugely influential in why we became people like Peter Carl, people like Ingrid, people like Tom Emerson. And so it's kind of really nice to then, I guess, come here under Ingrid's stewardship to talk. I guess also kind of, it's a year of anniversaries for us. It's 10 years since the Turner Prize, 15 years since the Cinerolium, which we sort of call our birthday. But I also think it's an interesting time where it is probably worth acknowledging it's a very difficult time in architecture. And I think it's a context that in some ways it's quite melancholy in the fact that like a lot of the chances we got when we were starting out, I don't think exist in the same way anymore. I think so there's a kind of sadness there as well. We're going to try something new. So we're going to show the book.
Or
in real life through this like OHP. So we're kind of channeling, secondary school vibes.
it's like your grandparents giving you a bedtime story.
Which we've not done in this format before, so it might be a little bit hokier than it has been. But loosely, the book is, it's worth saying it's not authored by us, it's authored by Aaron Betsky, which I think we're going to talk about a bit more later. But it's loosely kind of, it's shaped, which was kind of through conversation with us and Aaron, into sort of 7 themes. And so what we've done is we've kind of selected a project or 2 from each of these, some known, some less well known, to kind of give a little bit of a potted history. So putting on a show, making a home, going public, putting community, workshopping architecture, showing off, still assembling. And we're going to bring in a couple other live projects that we've kind of printed bits out for. To kind of chat about and kind of, I guess, maybe help talk about that question that Ingrid left off on, like, what's next, or what are we doing now, or what do we think we're interested in. That's it.
Nice. Okay, great. So we've got these stickers that we've divided in a collective fashion. So I'm going to begin by talking about Otto projects. So because there's lots of things in there, and we thought we'd try and pick out projects that maybe we talked about less. So this was a project that we started in 2011. It was probably one of our first clients. And obviously Otto Cafe, at the time was very cool. It's still very cool. And Hamish approached us, who's the owner, to build a temporary space for them in kind of near the cafe. And they really didn't have any money, but they have an amazing following and amazing culture, and we were really, really excited to work with them. And something that was meant to only last for like a year is actually still standing there, which, you know...
Looking slightly shabbier.
It's looking slightly, unfortunately, these boxes have become kind of public loos for late night men, but, that's urban.
That's Dalston.
Yes, Dalston. But I guess the cool thing about that project was it encapsulates some of the ideas that still excite us, just at a very small scale. So the idea of working with a community of people. So in this case, it's kind of very passionate music lovers and musicians and people that attend events and kind of international musicians that come to London and need a space for practicing, and kind of building things from things that are already there. And in this case, it was rubble. So we basically literally dug out the rubble from the site, put it into rice bags and compacted it and rendered it with cement and then kind of rubble dash. And it's this kind of buttress structure with prefab timber trusses clad in plywood, because we thought it was only going to be there for a year. So that was obviously not how we would build it. If we'd known it would be up for kind of 12 years, but it was really a really beautiful process, and a lot of the people that are part of the otter community still remember the time that they kind of chipped in. That's that.
Yeah. It was interesting, like the rubble also made a really interesting acoustic, which was sort of a slightly accident because it's such heavyweight walls, and because it's kind of quite faceted. It actually, we got told it makes a really nice acoustic for rehearsing in. We accidentally made, Hudson didn't want to spend however much money thinking about the filming, and we just stacks on stacks up.
Sliding scale. But it was really funny because obviously, Otto Cafe, as you might know, is quite experimental, and so it's, you walk past this space and you hear these quite strange noises coming out of it during the day. So it's quite a nice part of the street. Yeah.
Do you guys?
Sugar House, yes. So then I guess an important part of our practice has been and still is the place we work. And the first studios we've ever had is called Sugar House Studios because it was on Sugar House Lane. Not very imaginative perhaps, but in Stratford. And it really came out of just a need to store things from our first project, which was the Cinerolium. We had a bunch of chairs and materials and didn't really know what to do with them, didn't have a plan to start a practice or anything like that. And we got in touch with a number of public authorities, local authorities, and at the time it was the Olympic Park development. So this was again 2011, 2010, and there was a lot of development happening in that part of East London, and lots of properties that were awaiting redevelopment. They were sort of just standing, not really sure what they're used for, and so we were really lucky that OPLC, Olympic Park Legacy Corporation, offered us this warehouse in return for us kind of activating it. And so we began our kind of studio life there, which was really great. And over years, we've built a community of other makers who share the space with us and kind of have helped us set up more professional workshop facilities. Oh, this is Anthony using a kiln. And we've done a bunch of things there, like we ran a pizzeria, we thought we would make money by renting this space to a club promoter, which was really fun, but it was quite weird because obviously some of the nights we really enjoyed, but some of the music was not what we'd hoped for, and it would be we'd be working on the bar. And it was like a day rave. Oh yeah, there's day raves and night raves. And we were working the bar, selling Jägermeisters to complete strangers. And then the next day coming back to do work, with the sticky floor from the night before. And it was not the best business model maybe, but it was an interesting time of exploration. And then during that time, we've developed lots of thinking, I guess, about this idea of shared creative space and workshop space and what that means for us as designers and how important it is for us to have access to something which is big and messy and kind of more forgiving, I guess. And in that time, we proposed a design for a new build, which is the Yard House, new build studio building. And it's off-the-shelf materials, square plan, open timber frame, which is kind of filled out by the artists in it, kind of Alejandro Aravena style. And then the facade is the kind of special moment of celebration which we made the tiles for. continued on with this journey of running and developing spaces for making. And currently we are in East London again, and we are running a space in Brixton and in North Greenwich, each kind of having a specific focus. So North Greenwich, kind of really loud, messy metalwork and music production. The Brixton space is for cleaner textile work, and then our space is sort of furniture design, reggae band.
And maybe just on that, we are, maybe in terms of like the plan is like we're currently kind of looking at potentially buying or looking to try and buy a site actually very near us as a kind of longer term trajectory of that. So it's kind of interesting how that's happening. But it was slightly bizarre. We were negotiating to buy it like 2 years ago, and then Liz Truss happened, and all the borrowing costs went through the roof, and suddenly no one could afford anything. But it's kind of re-emerged. So it's kind of interesting to like be back in Bow and now like looking to maybe hopefully be able to invest in like a kind of permanent home, because we've always been like peripatetic. Which was really kind of exciting. On to Bodley Street Adventure Playground, and I guess thought this one quite interesting as it's a counter, happened very similar time to the work in Liverpool, was sort of also cited as part of the Turner Prize, but has a similar idea behind it, but the outcome is almost like entirely unarchitectural. In a similar way, it happened because we were invited to pitch for the main public arts commission of the Commonwealth Games. And the kind of brief to us was like, can you do something that isn't just visual, it's something that feels like embedded? And we kind of went up to Glasgow, a situation where most of the playgrounds look like this. So we're in Dalmarnock, east of Glasgow. It is really poor. It's one of the kind of highest child poverty rates in the whole of Europe. It's really tough context. And this, I guess, in a context where there's a lot of money flowing in for the games, but actually, in the perspective of the people living there, and especially children, change is very slow. And 5 years in the lifetime of a child is basically their whole life. And identified this site that we'd kind of loosely been told had been a playground at some point. And it was sort of half owned by the church, half owned by a local authority, and half owned, mixed owned by a housing association. And basically they agreed to let us sort of take it on and try and improve this process. And we've been reading, I guess, quite a lot of like, what's the word I want? Kind of literature around adventure playgrounds. It's quite linked to like anarchists, and the idea of like using this space to create a space that allowed the children to take ownership of it and create this kind of state of exception felt really valuable in an area where children are really kind of marginalised and excluded. And so we kind of quickly got in kind of October. We got tons of wood chip delivered. We got mud, and just like went up there in residence and kind of started operating it. Very quickly, you were introduced to two local play workers, brothers, Rob and Alan Kennedy, and they still kind of lead the playground to this day. And I guess an example of, while we weren't necessarily be able to carry the local presence, is like finding these really critical people who were able to come on board right from the beginning. And as a result, the playground is this kind of amazing, like the design is there. It's like, but it's there to facilitate. It's infrastructure facilitate a particular type of play. It's like the fence. It's drainage. It's hills. It's spaces that allow and processes that allow the kids to play. But critically, it's also organisation. So, for example, a lot of the kids are very poor. There's a huge barrier to play. They don't have shoes, they don't have coats, and so we invested in boots and coats so that the kids could come and play and they didn't get shouted at when they went home and they'd trash their clothes. It's a big area of food deserts, so this is actually the photo. It wasn't the wrong photo, anyway. But so we give 2 meals. We gave 2 meals a day on site. So it's kind of dealing with kind of really poor nutrition. Since then it's become one of the main local food banks. I think kind of because we established this conversation around food there, it's kind of naturally become about a food bank. And then critically, the kids were from the outset invited. So that's Robbie standing in the red coat. We all had red coats when we were there as play workers. All came together and would discuss what had happened every day and kind of make a plan for the next day. And so it was really about kind of at a really powerful level, and in a way that I think a lot of our work tries to do, but this is in some ways, as a project, most explicit, giving agency to people who are kind of often excluded from the way buildings are built. And allowing kids that were seen as like dangerous and, excluded from school to like run wild. And like we never had any problems because you're giving them freedom, you're giving them responsibility, and in some ways you're giving them trust. You're kind of believing in their ability. And that's kind of, felt hugely valuable. And I think as an organisation, we're sort of less involved now, but it's kind of recently celebrated its 10th birthday. Yeah, it's now 12th birthday. It's kind of expanding. It's now kind of a charity. It's now an actual portfolio organisation. So as a project, I think it's probably the most extreme end of where the architecture is almost invisible. And a lot of the architecture is about the organisation. And it's about creating the conditions in which things can happen. And also, I guess, the thing about kind of creating organisations that kind of get floated off into the world and can have their own life that we sort of are still kind of supporters and friends of. But I don't feel like the need to kind of control and hold on to. Over to you.
Nice, thanks. Great. This is another project that is, community relational project that we did that was formed part of an exhibition in Berlin in 2015 called The Wohnungsfrage, which is translated to housing question of housing. And it was a really interesting exhibition that invited different architects to engage with different community groups in Berlin to develop kind of hypothetical models of housing. And then these ideas were built as a kind of one-to-one prototype, but more was, I guess, these books and publications and drawings. We worked with curator, he's an architect, Jesko Faeser, but he was curator in this situation. He's great. He's actually designed a really cool building in Berlin, kind of example of a cooperative housing called R50. But he connected us to Stille Straße, which is a group of elderly squatters from Berlin, but it's not what you think. So they are, a lot of them are East Berliners who are just, your regular kind of citizens, and a lot of them struggled after the fall of the wall to kind of continue their careers. A lot of them maybe kind of retired early or felt that they were not really part of society in the same way as before. They had this community centre on a street called Stille Straße, which means kind of quiet street. And then, redevelopment, as anywhere else, was approaching, and there was a kind of threat to that building, and they squatted it. So these people who are in their 60s and 70s or 50s just stayed in the community centre for a few days, and they made these placards, and if you Google it, it'll come up. Unfortunately, this book maybe doesn't have the images of them so much, but it's just really funny in a way because they're not kind of your average image of a squatter. And it was cool to work with them because, and we were thinking about intergenerational housing, what that means to them. And a lot of questions came up about kind of flexibility and, what do you do when your kids leave home, and how do you kind of scale back these massive Berlin apartments or the Plattenbau that a lot of them were living in. We kind of developed lots of really interesting ideas and went to visit their homes and kind of focused in on this dynamic, which applies to Assemble, I guess, to some extent, of kind of a two-part house. One is a house that is secure and personal and owned, and then another side of it, which is the garage, which is rented, adaptable, collective, and that you might, when you have a bigger family, you might have both units, and then when you scale back, you have kind of one, and that it's all part of this one apartment block, and this, mixing kind of community uses with personal uses. And obviously this is very kind of East Berlin context. I don't know if this will apply in London, but it was a really interesting conversation and series of drawings and kind of ways of thinking that we really enjoyed. Yeah.
It's really, I forgot to talk about the other play projects. Should we just move on?
Oh, sorry.
I told you it wasn't going to be that slick. It's entirely my fault. Let's keep going. I think we'll
keep going.
Let's keep going. We can come back to it if we need.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. Like I said, I warned you maybe less slick than I thought.
All right.
I guess the next section is kind of workshopping architecture, and I guess this is maybe some of our maybe more like architecture with a kind of capital A. And so we'll talk about two projects there, which I guess maybe like bookend that. So the Goldsmiths CCA was our first serious sizable, permanent architectural commission working for an external client. I guess it came as, I guess a lot of us had sort of, the first couple of projects were very much kind of ad hoc, and then a bunch of us had gone back to study, and then as people were kind of coming out of studying, we were kind of actively looking at ways of, I guess, of professionalizing, but also being able to support ourselves as, not just kind of freelancers occasionally, but actually turning this into a kind of viable vocation. So I applied for this competition that was an open competition to do a public gallery for Goldsmiths College, City of London, University of London. And they took a real punt on us, really. Because at this point, we'd not built anything permanent. We'd kind of done like fun art projects and a kind of public realm scheme that was good, but it was like, it was very different. And we were up against, Tom Emerson and 6A and like serious people who we really respect. And, so it was quite a shock. I think for us, the thing, and talking to Richard Noble, who's the head of art and the client, about why he went with us is he said out of the architects who were shortlisted, we were the only ones who spent the majority of the time talking about how art would be shown. And like most other schemes talked a lot about circulation, and we really sold it as a series of spaces for both producing and I guess displaying art. And using these kind of new, and doing that through a series of kind of new insertions. So this big 1:30 model we made for the competition is a very weird site. It was the back of house. It was the kind of plant room, boiler room. It had been messed around with by kind of veneers and layers of kind of teaching spaces that were done very cheaply, and you couldn't really get between the floors. And so the kind of move was by inserting these kind of two new volumes, one of which you kind of see here, and using them to kind of create these kind of vertical cuts through the building. We were both providing the kind of classical white cube gallery spaces, but also providing the kind of vertical connectivity between the different spaces. I guess the center, key one of this being this kind of forum center that really kind of connects it. And then I guess there was a kind of constant dialogue about how, what of our more kind of DIY ad hoc way of working we could bring into a more, I guess, professional context with a client who was, a client had a budget and it was a very kind of traditional process. And the way we did it was really looking at materiality in a very focused way, and in the way that we had done in the early projects. So we looked at kind of making our own stains, looked at making tiles for the bathrooms, and maybe the biggest piece was the facade. And here we went around the houses. We looked at, I guess, cast iron. It was just after 6A's Paul Smith shop being done. So really sexy facade. But we had nowhere near the budget for that. We looked at hammered aluminium, and basically the point where the budget we had versus the aspirations just weren't matching. And so we're looking kind of off the shelf components, and came across, this is fiber cement tiles that are traditionally used on agricultural buildings, but then playing with them and testing them out. So this is a one-to-one mock-up in our original sugar house as a way of making a kind of intentional nod to the cast iron tanks and then staining them ourselves. And this version, you can see there was a kind of decorated kind of cornice with these kind of bespoke parts that unfortunately you can see in the reality got VE'd out. But I think that the main intent was still there. It's this idea of dialogue, new and old, and the kind of material vibrancy that talks to tanks while still not doing it. And then kind of alongside that, designed a chair, which turns out designing chairs are really hard. It kind of looks cool, but as a product, we got it's kind of we talked to this the furniture designer, a furniture producer in Italy called Magis, and it's very crafted, and sort of that was not meant as a compliment. And I guess through kind of to use the images, I guess but the idea of this is it was to create a kind of richness and variety within a building that was so kind of celebrating the kind of raw existing fabric, creating kind of new high quality gallery spaces. These are actually 120 models we did just after the competition, but we kind of used similar ones in the competition. Actually, this one is from the competition. Maybe they're both from the competition. Yeah. God, I can't remember now. And having this clear juxtaposition of kind of old and new, and how these kind of the new insertions were clearly like knitting together this kind of weird building. I think this was actually an accident. We didn't realise that this room was tiled because it was all hidden by kind of fluff and stuff and plasterboard and whatever happens. But this idea that once you took the floor away, you could kind of see the traces of the old building was really a kind of nice surprise. And I guess in some ways it's still one of the, I guess, few of these type of buildings we've completed. But I think it while it's a kind of like I said, architecture with a kind of capital A, I think it also still talks an attitude of kind of craft and making and hands-on working that I think we've like really tried hard to kind of hold on to kind of through our work.
And I guess another project of a similar scale that was talking about these things is our recently completed building in Arles in south of France, and that was a project done in collaboration with BC, Belgian practice specialised in earth construction. And that was a really eye-opening experience, I think, for us to just witness the possibilities of these kind of more ecological materials, alternative materials, possibilities of experimentation when you have a budget and kind of an ambitious client. And so it was a really great experience and actually quite an efficient project. I think it was all done in 4 years. It's like 2,500 metres square footprint, renovating an old stone train depot building in France. And we worked a lot with this idea of bi-regional design, which is kind of spearheaded by Jan Boelen, our client. Kind of working with all the amazing limestone quarries in the region, the history of pigment making and like Roussillon and places like that, where you get kind of these amazing ochres, and thinking about kind of reuse at a scale that we haven't really worked on before. It was a great experience, and I think it was also obviously kind of a one-off project in the sense that it's not a model that you can replicate, but it's a kind of example of what is possible, that these materials do work. And so there's kind of 3 key spaces, and they're all designed for the Atelier Luma, which is this experimental materials lab, research lab, exploring kind of algae plastics and waste, invasive species as dyes, all that stuff. And so 3 main spaces. This one made of rammed earth and prefab earth blocks is all about kind of quiet, reflective lab space. And then you can see actually this space here is a kind of workshop, a messy, loud workshop space. And there's a new mezzanine timber frame that we designed that has a rhythm within which different kind of units are based. So you have like a wood workshop, a ceramic workshop, a dye workshop. So kind of stuff that I guess we're kind of used to running, but not in this sort of slick way. And there were lots of really interesting details that we were able to explore. Like we had to re-insulate the building, and we decided to do that on the outside. So we took off the existing tiled roof and insulated it, and then in the process of putting the tiles back on, some of them broke, and so then those broken tiles were sliced and used in the floor terrazzo in the building. There's a kind of render on the outside of the building that's using waste tiles and bits from the quarries. Lots of other things like the Camargue. So this is a kind of agricultural region around Arles where you have lots of sunflowers and rice harvesting, and this is where Van Gogh actually painted the sunflowers. We worked a lot with kind of waste from those kind of crops to make insulated panels and compressed panels and acoustic renders and things like that. And then the third part of the building was kind of just kept as found for more flexible uses.
Cool.
Toilet. Different project.
Different project, yeah. And then I guess the last section of the book is showing off, and that I guess focuses on a bunch of kind of exhibitions, generally exhibitions that I guess rather than just being exhibition designers, we were kind of active, either not artists is the wrong word, but like creators of, participants of, and what we thought we'd talk about is kind of 3 projects of this that we did in collaboration with Granby Workshop, as we've sort of intentionally not talked about Liverpool, as it feels like it's the kind of most well covered. But I guess we felt it would be kind of nice to talk about a kind of ongoing relationship with Granby Workshop and a kind of method of using these type of opportunities as ways of kind of pushing design, being very optimistic, very opportunistic even. First one is a factory as it might be, which is a nod obviously to the kind of utopian piece by Morris, where it kind of like combines industry and education, this kind of like socialist ideal. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend it. Which I've always told all our students to read it. And I think it's also not a recognition that, like, in a way, lots of things we talk about, especially with Granby Workshop and more generally, do owe a lot with Morris and kind of the arts and crafts, and in some ways actually have some of the same problems about scalability and cost and things like that. So in many ways he feels like a kind of important figure in our work. This was at ADO, which was a mini-funded kind of art space in New York that is sadly closed. I guess that's one of these kind of reflection on the type of opportunities that just feel like they no longer exist. This was, really mourned in the press for New York when it kind of shut, because it did a lot of it launched the careers of lots of really interesting kind of designers. And I guess talking about being opportunistic, we use it a way of essentially like paying for R&D time for Granby Workshop and to invest in new equipment and kind of look at new materials. And we kind of partnered with 3 artists that we'd worked with before, Will Shannon, who worked on us on the Granby Rock stuff, Molly Anna King, who basically produced most of the tiles for Yard House, and Niamh Riordan, who had worked on kind of a lot of the kind of booklet for Granby Workshop at the beginning, and basically kind of rigged out this courtyard as a kind of test bed, made a bunch of different stuff using a pug extruder. This actually isn't one, but we thought it's the closest thing we could find in the office of like kind of extruded thing. Actually, no, I've got one here, which I'll show you later. And then over time, it kind of, I guess, focused on tiles as an output. I think this is the same. This kind of mirrors a process in the workshop from going and making way too much stuff and being kind of doing everything, doing carpentry and stuff, and realizing as a business model that kind of fundamentally isn't viable, to focusing on really architectural ceramics, which is what it does today. And then using those to kind of clad the front of the building in a kind of nod to Yard House, but with a much, I guess, limited palette, and I guess with kind of tighter product tiles. And then the kind of finished thing was kind of left up for a month. And I guess, like I said, it really provided a kind of R&D process to the point where this is a very different tile, but this is a tile that's been developed for the latest project in Granby, which is a kind of replacement when the building's been demolished, which uses kind of waste clay to create a kind of series of brick slips for a building. Kind of nods, both is a nod to Granby. I think I've got another one somewhere. Anyway, that kind of is a series of different kind of variant tiles that are all kind of extruded. And so, like, I guess, like, lessons from this process are still kind of used by the workshop to this day. The next one, which was the next year, was we were invited as Assemble, to put something in the Venice Biennale. This is 2018, and similar, I guess, this idea of being kind of opportunistic, sort of looked at partnering with Granby Workshop, develop a new tile. At the time, we'd been offered this other project in Venice called Laguna Viva for the VAC Foundation, now closed because it's owned by a Russian oligarch. And so again, like, as probably everyone who's been involved in the Venice Biennale knows, like, the aspirations are sky high, the budgets are extremely low, and they somehow expect you to magic up. And so we sort of twinned the 2 projects together. And so the tiles that were made for the exhibition and developed for the exhibition would then be transferred, sort of, to the new space with a few hiccups along the way. And I guess created a kind of ongoing, interesting kind of splat, kind of essentially like crushing under high press under high pressure.
Press.
Yeah.
This is also a round press.
Which also generated splatware, which is worked by a kind of process of kind of marbling through coloured clay, which was kind of fun, and again talked about like production. Again, very well, like William Morris nod. And then the tiles we transferred to the garden of this palazzo that the Foundation, the VAC Foundation, kind of occupy, working with a kind of artist and environmental scientist called Jane de Moster, who is a founder of a group called We Are Here Venice, which is kind of sort of anti-tourism, but anti the damage of tourism, really, rather than anti-tourism. And so the kind of ponds were capturing microcosms of the lagoon biosystem, and they pump canal water out that are kind of hugely under threat, as we know, cruise ships and all this sort of problem. And this kind of creates a kind of garden seating area. So by kind of connecting these two projects, each project kind of could tell its own story, but we could kind of rob Peter to pay Paul, and doing so kind of be able to do both. And I think I guess it talks about a way of trying to continue these relationships with organisations, but also I guess trying to work in a very opportunistic way. So there's a kind of long-term idea, but you kind of take opportunities that come along the way. And it's something that kind of followed on. I'm not going to talk about this, but like other exhibitions have kind of followed in this footstep. And then ending slowly on kind of current work and the sort of still assembling and sort of what's next. I guess we're going to show two from the book, and then we're going to give a sneak peek at one that I'm not allowed to kind of completely show, but keep them waiting. And then a kind of more complete project that's kind of that's kind of really interesting. I think this is quite interesting because it's just the complete opposite end of the scale of anything we've done, which is Derry Road, which is a industrial master plan for something like 1 million square meters of industrial floor space in Canberra, Australia, invited through the developer Malonglo. I think for us, it's like how you sort of scale some of these like urban ideas, and I guess some of the ideas about workspace. And I think that was really why they talked to us, because of our kind of history of running workspace, but scaling up to and into the kind of logic of a developer. And in this sense, the kind of way it worked is like incredibly rational, very lithe buildings, I guess, looking at the kind of Albert Kahn type things in Detroit. Got really stuck on my Kahns there. It's like Adam Kahn, Louis Kahn. So the buildings are sort of super efficient. And then it was also like an interesting way of like thinking about how you communicate ideas at big distances. So here we kind of spend a lot of time on kind of detailed models, so like 1 to 50, 1 to 200 models that accompany drawings, because I guess because of its distance, because we're not there, there's a kind of executive architect who's delivering it for us. It's like, how do you communicate what are quite subtle, quite refined, hopefully, ideas about environmental control, about facades, about structure, that actually are very hard to kind of essentially depict in planning drawings. And there's a kind of sort of more like physical proposal, showing those proposals, like definitely a kind of nod to I forgot the Belgian, the Danish architect. Anyway, I'll come back to me. This is
a bit Glenn Merker as well.
Yeah, a bit Glenn Merker as well, but I think Hans Christian.
Hansen.
Yeah. Sorry, I've got a baby, so I'm slightly underslept. But yeah, and it's currently in planning, so sort of we're kind of waiting for it to see what happens next. But these are being built. Interestingly, Chipperfield is doing the kind of residential component of that site, so it's a huge master plan, of which I think most of it is resi, and that's Chipperfield is doing, and then we're doing this kind of industrial chunk of it. So it's a massive bit of the city outside Canberra. Were you going to talk about House Netta, or was I?
I think I was, but
you talk about it.
It was just very briefly. This is another live project in Spitalfields, which is actually now kind of set up as an independent organisation from Assemble, but we're still a bit connected. But it's a renovation of a beautiful house in Spitalfields, and it used to be owned by Annette Pedretti, who was a cybernetics artist, beekeeper, activist, punk, I don't know. She did many things, and I think she was very loved in the community, and her house is owned now by a Swiss foundation that is Edith Naring Foundation. It's all about kind of maintaining property away from speculation and kind of continuing its community use and stuff like that. So it's an ongoing project. They're trying to get money to kind of insulate the building because it's a listed building and it's very difficult, very expensive to do. But in the meantime, they're running lots of amazing workshops and kind of hosting groups that focus on land activism, and people like Land in Our Names and other organisations who have been involved. And it's sort of it's quite fluid, but also quite focused. I think it's a really interesting project. And if you're in town, I'm sure you can pop by and say hello to them.
And we're just about to submit a Heritage Lottery Fund bid for, I think, however many, but several million to kind of bring it up to speed. I guess what's interesting about this is, like, I guess we're still trying to be really active in these kind of self-delivered projects, and it's just what's happened is they've got so much slower than maybe they were happening in before. And this is a one that feels like it's about to. It is already great, but like the building is sort of not very safe in the long run. But it feels like it's like poised to kind of go somewhere, and they're doing really great work. And then got two projects then to
Outside of the book.
talk about outside the book, and maybe the first one, which is I'll talk about very briefly because it's sort of I'm not supposed to talk. It's public knowledge, but I'm not supposed to kind of share the details of the design yet. Which is we're doing a Maggie Centre in Maidstone, Kent, which was quite an odd process in that they asked us and we were like assuming there'd be a competition, and then they thought we weren't interested, and it was just because we were just not. We just thought there must be like some sort of oh, what's the next step? And they're like, no, you've got it. And so there's kind of weird like mismatch of communications. We realised we're like, oh. Yeah, why aren't you happy? Like, oh, no, sorry, we're really excited. Yeah. So after that initial kind of false start, it was really great. And I think for us, it was a bit like how Maria talked about Luma. I guess these kind of unique projects are ways of pushing ideas. It's really a privilege to have a client who really believe in the quality of design. And for us, and for Maggie, it's about like, let's push your kind of environmental credentials. In some ways, it's try a type of architecture that they're very known for, kind of very, I guess, formally strong, very beautiful, but like which is not what we do. And so we kind of took a step back and be like, right, we're going to do a building that feels like it's of its place, that's kind of built from its place, that's like taking this idea of kind of building from the bioregion. So looking at the geology, looking at the landscape of the kind of North Downs and the Kent Wold, the High Wold, and looking at the kind of vernacular of these kind of amazing barns, to do something that feels at home, but then simultaneously feels kind of familiar and contemporary. And then doing it so with like a material palette that combines like reclaimed, so these are concrete cement tiles there are thousands of them because they get stripped off local authority buildings and no one likes them because they're ugly as sin. But trying to like find ways of using them in a way that kind of transcends that. Combining that with, and so these are kind of different treatments. We're working with Local Works Studio, who are really like long-standing collaborators with us, looking at different treatments to the tiles that can both protect them, because getting kind of guarantees or being able to assure performance of reuse materials is a real challenge. And it's a real barrier in the UK to using reused materials because you can't get a warranty, and lots of clients, for obvious reasons, require warranties. But looking at kind of treatments, these are kind of mica paints to simultaneously kind of match them together, but also kind of restore them. But combining that with, I guess, like high-end natural materials. So it's the site is a mile from the last quarry that produces Kentish ragstone, which is what the Tower of London's built out of. And using the fact that it's a mile away, that means we can get really big lumps. So this is a Peter Zumthor reference. It's the thing he did for living architecture. That kind of allows us to use kind of worse, lower grade stone rather than the kind of really precious stuff that you cut into slices, because the shipping costs are really small, which normally would be prohibitively expensive. So kind of like big lumps of stone, which is quite fun. And yeah, this is the kind of, this was shown at the RA Summer Show, so I think it's fine to show this publicly. But it's currently in for planning, and once it receives planning, which we're currently in Section 106 agreements to do with biodiversity net gain, which is an interesting experience because no one knows. It's the first time everyone's done the process, so it doesn't seem like anyone anywhere in the council elsewhere knows how to do it. It's like one of the things where the government put this big bit of legislation in and like no one actually knows how it works. But the idea being that you've got these two large barns that are kind of linked by a kind of timber kind of gallery space that creates a kind of very fluid arrangement. But yeah, hopefully in the near future we'll be able to show kind of more finished pictures of what the kind of vision will be. But I thought it was quite nice to talk about process and talk about like ideas in terms of materiality and ways of building that feel very current in terms of the way we're thinking.
Yeah, and then the last project we're working on is it's this kind of weird, amazing project in Japan, in rural Japan. It's a huge redevelopment of rice paddy fields into a public park. And they've invited lots of architects from Japan and abroad to do things. And this is a book, concept book that they used in press. So you can see this is kind of some of the renders. And Dan Pearson's doing a meadow, and that's Dan Pearson. Sorry, Nori, amazing architect from Japan. Nori, they're doing this kind of welcome plaza, lots of shops and things like that. Lena Gottman's doing a big viewing tower. That's Lena. So it's really nice photos. And then, yes, her again. Mandai are doing a huge playground. That's Mandai Architects. But it's all about kind of reconnecting to nature and kind of, I guess, is focused in on Japanese and international tourists coming kind of to this part of the Japan in rural Toyama, which is not as kind of popular yet. Anyway, so this is us. We're doing a campsite, which is, I guess, the kind of the most rogue part of the scheme. You know, there's a sort of high-end housing and villas and restaurants, and ours is definitely the kind of slightly like wilder edge of the project. But, you know, we are still designing buildings for campers to shower and to have a tea and classrooms and shops and things like that. And it's been a really lovely thing to work on, just, I guess, being outdoors in nature and thinking about materials and working also with incredible craftspeople there. And so we've been developing a range of quite simple forms because, you know, the budget isn't endless, and there are also other constraints such as, I guess, seismic activity, and also the fact that they get amazing snow, like 2 meters of snow every winter, and then the summer's really hot. So there's a lot of kind of, just architectural constraints. And we've been working also with Lewis Jones, who was part of Assemble and now has also set up a materials kind of research lab. So we're working with him on developing a number of interesting materials. So some of them include kind of making paints from stuff in a landscape. Just going to, and generally, I guess, sort of building the buildings from what is there, which is a lot of sugi trees, so cedar sugi, the earth itself, the rice plants, there used to be rice paddies, and obviously the rice fibers can be used in insulation, and also the carbonized rice husk in insulation and in ceramics and things like that. And so we've been kind of developing a range of materials and pigments that we're making from things around there. And this is a kind of diagram just looking, for example, at the pigments are naturally occurring from shellfish limestone, site clay, and then kind of anthropogenic from sort of more industrial products like this tile factory that we're collaborating with, and they have lots of broken tiles that we're reusing for the kind of more red pigment, and then kind of constructed colours such as Egyptian blue and Egyptian green. Some of the kind of interior images, a little summary of materials. So it should be finished in 2 years, hopefully. Some stuff here. I think that's it. Yeah, maybe end on this plate.
I have so many questions. You have no idea. And I think this is a massive disadvantage because I have to say to the room, and particularly to you guys, it's a little bit like being your grandmother who's come to sort of tell a room about, your life. Because I think, you've spoken really beautifully about a range of projects and in quite a granular way. And I think what may escape your audience is, first of all, it's been an extraordinary journey. I was reminiscing with the two of you earlier that I kind of remember, the equivalent of the projects review and, James Binning and Alice Edgerly sort of trotting up and going like, I think we have this site and we would really like to do something and we're really bored of like year out practice and we just want to make something. So we're having this conversation. And then it seemed like 5 minutes later, everyone you'd ever known was involved in Cineroleum in some sort of early Facebook group or something. There was it was one of those things that felt like people coming together because they could and they just kind of wanted to, and that you were all so resourceful and had a kind of why not attitude. And then, as I seem to remember, then suddenly you had funding. And then suddenly you had the Turner Prize. And then you're like Royal Academicians. And you're like, how did this happen? So, and of course, it's been nearly 20 years or 15 years. But that's a lot. And out of that, you assembled a practice that has gone from something that is highly experimental to capital A architecture. And what's interesting about the book, because really I want to talk about the book mainly, is that it does separate into these chapters. But I think what's potentially interesting for the audience is, and I'm going to be really rude here. I bumped into Anthony about a month and a half ago in the departure lounge in Heathrow.
Nice chat.
And I was like, so, you got a monograph now. Does that mean you're finished? Because there's something really peculiar about someone who's not here, Aaron Betsky, telling your story and wrapping you up as if it's a complete chapter. And I'm really curious if this feels like it's an anniversary, but it also with the publication of the book and again packaging this history that goes from something so simple and fragile to something of the scale of working alongside David Chipperfield. And there's still the fragility of kind of working with materials, etc. There's all of you going off into different specialisms with a seriousness and a professionalism that it is leading the profession in very different directions, all very individually. But this is a very particular moment, and I'm wondering, you've read the book. Do you feel comfortable with this package? Do you read it with a kind of weak distance?
I guess I sort of said in the bar, I was like, it's something actually quite freeing about someone else writing it, and it being clear that it is Aaron's perspective, and we obviously work really closely with him in conversations. But I think in the sense, like Assemble are a collective and are still is a group of people, and they are. The reality is they're like multiple histories. And if you asked me to give a history, you asked Maria to give a history, you asked James to give a history, we would give it probably quite a different history based on our own individual experience of going through that process. And I think in that sense, this isn't the history, it is a history. And it's really nice to have that in the world. And I think it's nice to have that perspective and have someone, in some ways, actually give your story back to you, because it's something, you spend like a lot of time internally, like sometimes, sometimes nicely, sometimes agonizing over what you're doing well, what you're doing wrong. It's actually, as I said, like it's freeing to have someone else give you a kind of critical reflection that you can be part of, but you don't have to try and tell the authoritative story of Assemble in that way. And I think that's how I would, personally, I understand it in a way.
How about you, Maria?
Yeah, I think it does feel like a momentous, on the one hand, it does feel a bit like apocalyptic, but on the other hand, it also feels like, oh, it's great, we have a portfolio we can show clients.
Yeah.
Finally, like we tried to make a book ourselves and it we didn't quite get there, and
So you can make a building but not a book.
but yeah, we tried to make a book about collaboration, and it didn't work. So I think it's really amazing to just have this there. It kind of legitimizes us. But it's also funny because there was like a guy who used to run our pizzeria. We used to be behind the bar, and he came into the office the other day and he saw the book. He's like, "Oh, this is so cool." He's like, "Oh, is that time when we, did this thing which randomly happened after Christmas and no one knew about it? Is that in the book?" And I'm like, "No." And it's like, there's all this other stuff that isn't there. So I think it's not fully packaged yet.
This is probably a really silly, unanswerable question. But when I was speaking to you in the bar and I was thinking about the sort of packaging and Aaron's very particular take, I think what really sort of threw me is he's historicized you.
Yeah.
So if you read the first section, there's a lot of arts and crafts. There's a lot of Surges and Bates and Cruises Engine, and you think, really, that's fine. But it's interesting that then he's sort of imposed a whole bunch of references that I never knew were influencing you. That's fine. I kind of wish you could do another one that was a fictionalized version of your story, because in a way it is a fiction.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
I remember also when you talk, it's kind of like the myth. It's like a creation myth as well. It's like it is a myth, and it becomes mythologized. And I think you're right in that sense.
But I think it's interesting. As you go through the book, I find it's fascinating. I'm actually really glad you didn't present it in the order of the book, because I was saying to some people earlier, it's kind of curious that it's chronological, because then it does feel complete in that it's a story that is then told by somebody else, and it ends, and so that's very peculiar. But I think what's interesting, if you look at the projects, particularly as they evolve, given that you're a group of people of a shifting number and shape in many ways, depending on the project, etc. The projects are really bold. Just from an architectural perspective, they often involve quite clear volumes that have a tremendous material clarity. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because it's a curious thematic that particularly runs to the early work, and then feels as if it has a very strong influence on, say, Goldsmiths, which I remember when you got him. I think we were all like, "Oh my God, they're going to have to do like a gigantic project. This is insane."
It also like the process of, I really remember like having no sleep for about 3 days, and then hiring a zip fan and driving the model while the London Marathon was coming past our studios. We had to like argue with the policeman to let us out, and it's like this thing of like, you at one point you'll be presenting as a professional, at the other point you're like in this fuzzy warehouse, having not slept for 3 days, trying to argue with the policeman to be able to drive out.
But I think what's interesting, that what that model shows is, again, a series of very kind of quite determined volumes. That then it's not the first time you're working with an existing space, but it feels, in a way, when you start building your own working spaces, that becomes about an existing condition in a way that the early projects aren't. And somehow for me, Goldsmiths is that combination of kind of bold volumes that are intersecting with a very kind of careful editing of an existing condition. And I'm kind of, maybe that was a moment of awareness. I don't know if there's a moment of reflection on how you deal with that transition between something that's has a tremendous confidence for something that has to be collaborative.
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I feel like we do have a design culture, and I do think some of it comes from our time at Cambridge. There was a clarity in that education that was focusing on kind of the public sector and kind of the reality of building. Obviously, you're still a student. I didn't follow the reality at the time, but like there was still a kind of culture of respecting architecture in its most simplest manifestations and reality of what building is. And I feel like a lot of people in Ensemble carry that genealogy.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I agree. It's interesting because it's one of the things that maybe we don't actually speak about internally that much, or haven't historically. It's just it's a kind of emergent quality. And then, as you said, people, I guess in the same way, you don't put together a book like this to be able to reflect on it. But like Jane and I were talking about it in the context of Maggie's, because I guess you could tell that we were quite different to the way that lots of the architects I work with were presenting in terms of, and we almost talked about like we're quite primitivists. Like the things are quite simple, and like the layers are generally to be quite simple, and they're like bold, but there's a kind of, I guess, a clarity to them, and the things are the things.
Yeah.
I think actually when you look at lots of like, it's quite different also like high tech architecture, and a lot of the way modern architecture is built. You know, where things are, and this isn't a criticism of high tech. I love high tech. I can't do it.
Maybe, I wonder if it's to do with the fact that, yeah, because we don't have a single author, and obviously there are, you know, people are different in the way that they draw and everything, but because we have a responsibility to the collective, you can't really go too mad with like weird shapes. You have to sort of communicate to each other. You have a responsibility to kind of make ideas quite clear.
I guess clear and quite like
grounded,
like fundamental. They're quite
Yeah, but strangely, I think the impression I get is that often collaboration tends to kind of dilute a set of ideas. And I mean, not always. There's some really great collectives out there, but I think, you know, actually, material choices are quite bold. The form is often quite bold. The simplicity of the construction is quite bold, and to retain boldness through compromise is quite odd. And I think, you know, there is I wouldn't say that there's an assemble type, but I think if you go back through, you know, the pavilion structures, there's you know, that they're playing with they're very playful with typology. They operate at a kind of unusual scale. Things are kind of scaled up or scaled down. So there's thematics that run through that are quite distinct as a practice, that feel almost like the individual hand. And I know from having known you all a long time, sort of bookending your careers as they stand at the moment, you know, again, there's very, very different characters that are part of that conversation. I don't know if you could kind of talk a little bit about how those conversations go, a little bit. I mean, obviously they happen over a number of days and weeks and months, but is there some insight into like how you handle even those discussions around material, form, the origins of a project, etc.?
It's one of those like it's hard because there's like you don't often have this like moment of self-reflection, and I think the thing that interesting, I guess maybe there's a moment of transition where like the first project, so the Cinerolium, the Folly, and then I guess to some extent things like New Yankton, where like everyone piled in and the decisions were these kind of completely collective things, and then after that, the structure was much more that like project had 2 minimum, sometimes 3 kind of buddies who sort of led it, but that as much as possible, the decisions were very kind of collectively critiqued, and I think that maybe helps with that, where they are authors and they're not necessarily very publicly talked about, but projects have like authors, but that there's like a kind of collective interrogation of that, and I think part of maybe the consistency, as Maria said, comes from the fact that we came through a tradition that was in Cambridge that was felt very humanist, that really prioritised a very particular way of making architecture over maybe like other kind of institutions. And I think that while maybe is embedded in some of those things about like clarity, simplicity of construction, kind of honestness of materials, but a kind of playfulness, I think kind of is implied, but then is reinforced, I guess, through that kind of way of working, which is like you have a lead, you have 2 leads, but then like lots of people kind of at key moments will pile in and kind of blow it up, and you end up putting it back in, and you blow it up and you put it back in again, and that in a way, I guess it gets rid of lots of fluff as a process.
Yeah, and maybe because we haven't really reflected on that, but maybe there's also the early days of kind of quite theatrical buildings because they were temporary theatre event spaces that had to have an impact with not much. Maybe that has carried on, of like how do you make a theatrical thing? There's an enjoyment of that.
That's quite funny because Aaron goes on a lot about the theatricals, as he calls them, in Cambridge, which I never, did not ring true to me. I never heard of theatricals. But I think that there is something about the ambiguity of what is temporary and what is permanent. And perhaps in some way also the working with materials helps bridge that ambiguity. Is that something, does that ring true at all?
I'd say also like the intent was never for things to be temporary. It was like that was the only way you could do things. And so I guess temporary wasn't a virtue, and making things out of borrowed, like the materials, they weren't like, they were necessities. Yeah. And so I guess but the design intent maybe was always for things that would feel permanent and feel, I guess, does that make sense? I mean, it's not I think it's one of the ones that's like it's a hard one to identify.
Maybe it's because we started off in this kind of set building scale, because we just made it ourselves. There was a respect and an interest for understanding how things are made. And I think, we often look at quite romantic references, like vernacular buildings, or like architecture without architects, or I don't know, just kind of things that we can enjoy how they were built and think about those things. And I think that's continued, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think it's a funny thing, because there isn't one single figure authority, but there is an authority of legacy in the sense that you want your project to be as cool as that project over there. Yeah. And that project was cool because it had this cool timber columns with the stain or whatever. So there's a sort of ongoing learning from each other and sort of...
Went through a blue period. There's lots of blue happening, for example.
Ceramics.
There was definitely a thing. Yeah. I also think I think underpinning also there's always a real deep commitment to the context. And that isn't necessarily literally kind of vernacular figurative, but materials come from the area, come from the brief. And I think there's always from the Cinerolium, there onwards, in that sense, the context is the petrol station. Some of the things were playing with the ideas of drive-throughs and so the context doesn't have to necessarily be the literal physical context, but I think we are very contextual in our approach, and I think that does maybe help make both permanent and temporary projects feel like they belong to the same world, because the key driver, looking at things like here, like the Folly, like Goldsmiths, which is permanent Cinerolium, that kind of, I guess the Yard has maybe a bit of an outline there, but yeah, there's a kind of nod. I mean, that one, the kind of game was the kind of decorated facades of Baroque cathedrals. I guess there's no idea about how they sit in a kind of contextual understanding of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I mean, there's probably a whole other book to be written about the nature of Britishness. I mean, there's obviously a kind of cross section in your own group. So Britishness is a bit of a funny one, but and in some ways, what I wanted to say is that I feel from an AA context, you kind of operate a bit like an ideal unit, like a diploma unit where there's a bit of collaboration, but quite a lot of competition. And I think that's an interesting pedagogical model that can keep things fresh, but we can move on to that. But yeah, I mean, I think that the other day I was talking to, actually it was on Friday with Max Creasy, opening to one of the architects, and he was a Swiss architect who was really admiring the sort of early work of Surtees and Bates. He said, yeah, it's sort of bits of brick sort of stuck on things, and it's really flimsy and sort of pasted together. And he said it was really disappointing is then they started doing this very kind of robust thing in Switzerland, and actually what he kind of missed is that kind of make do and fake something. And I think that it's interesting to watch, say, your transition from, say, Goldsmiths through to Atelier Luma, where this question of, when the budget gets bigger and you have the opportunity to do things that are robust and sensible, does that feel painful in some way? It's a tremendous privilege, and I think your career has been marked by play and a degree of playful privilege. Projects are such gifts so much of the time, and it's a real testament to your ambition. But I think sometimes when things get proper, does it feel hard?
I can't say that working in the south of France felt very hard, but it had its own challenges. But I think that was a gift, definitely, as a project, to try some of these things for real. And I think, the fun stuff was the residencies and things. Some of the things that didn't make it into the building, it still had its moments of play. It's just different, I think. But there are other contexts where it does become more difficult, especially when I think people, want to work with us because of this idea about us and what we can bring. But then the realities of that project don't actually allow for that play, but it's still a serious project that has to be done. And so then it's what are we actually bringing here? And that can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I guess in some ways there's frustration in a lot of the way buildings are delivered in England, particularly, which is very constrained. And there's you start with big aspirations, and then you get kind of put in this kind of sausage kind of press about the way things are delivered, and you kind of feel like you often ring. I actually think Luma and Maggie's are probably exceptions to that. But the kind of way I think the UK is particularly hard in terms of how we deliver buildings, and there's the reason why pretty much 90% of the buildings look the same. You know, we've got New London vernacular. I remember the Part 3 tutor described it as like you're designing like frocks for buildings that already are determined by the economics. And I think for me, I guess it's actually the frustration comes less from the kind of
Say frocks,
frocks.
not frogs.
No, not frogs. Frocks, like dresses for planning.
Yeah.
You know, you've got this box that has
Frogs would be better there.
and you want to get
That's a good
planning,
idea.
so you design you put the frock on it, and that's what the architect does. And I guess it's, I guess the difficulty seems to be like understanding how we can try and do things a bit more permanent, but at the same time, how you intersect with that kind of, I guess, culture delivering buildings that feels very mean and very tight. And I guess through 10 years of austerity, has only got meaner and tighter. And I think that's, for personally speaking, that's where my like worry and sadness, I guess, comes in. That you start with good intentions, and often the client doesn't, and just like the structure by which we deliver things. You know, an example being things like needing warranties on, and so suddenly you've got aspiration to reuse material, and like, oh yeah, we can't get a 15-year warranty on it.
Yeah, that feels stressful.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We had a long conversation with James Binning
Extreme,
about
yeah.
mortgage and ownership and
Yeah.
etc. So I think this is obviously a concern that reaches all of you in very, very different ways. I don't want to hog this conversation, so I will slowly wrap up my side of things. But I think it is an extraordinary book, and I think what's interesting to me and hopefully valuable to you is that all those expectations. I mean, here there is evidence that one cannot expect you to be 25. The people that came together to do something by accident. And I think that's always going to be, it's a blessing and a curse. Because, and you were designing play spaces before you had children. You have children now, and suddenly you have to be a grown-up, and the buildings, reflect that, and that's important. But I think I kind of want to end my comments on, I had such a wonderful evening. I know Maria's going to get really bored of me saying this. At the kind of Frieze in Regent's Park where, you produced this fiber dog, which, we laugh about, but actually there's a little clip on your Instagram of describing the sort of possibility. And pretty reputable furniture makers in Milan did the structure, and, it's a dog. It's a wicked
Very
dog.
big dog.
Giant dog. It's huge. And it has a delight and a playfulness and a material sincerity that I think, I want you not to forget, because I think that there's a level of individual and collective invention and playfulness that is exactly what separates you from every other architect doing some buildings. There's a resourcefulness that has wit. And so I think as much as there's some wonderful projects, I think let's not forget that you wanted to enjoy yourselves, nearly 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and hopefully still are. So with that note, I'm going to open up to the floor to see if anyone would like to ask their own questions. These lovely people.
Good.
Hi, I mean, you showed some very...
Can we have the general lights up a little bit so we could see everyone else?
You showed some very... I mean, I remember a lot of the projects that you showed, they're very kind of progressive projects in a really special way, I think, in that they gave people both permission here to practice in a different way, and they kind of held practice in London to account when your projects kind of became publicly known. So I thought it was really incredible quality of them. Every time they arrived, I was really excited, felt slightly guilty for not having done better. But I kind of guess I recall this period when the practice was developing and growing, where it felt a bit like the early days of the French Revolution. Not the terror, but the kind of bit afterwards or a bit before, where you're kind of inventing political mechanisms on the hoof in order to be able to cope with so many non-autocratic decision makers. And I think that struck me as a very unusual political structure that required all this innovation. Long rambling question about how that felt from your side.
felt very similar. I'd say, like, I mean, yeah, it's still changing. It's not static, and we've had to. I think in some ways, what Ingrid said also, like, those early projects were sort of powered by like pure energy, and a bunch of us are kids, like me included. Like, you don't have that same leeway, and I guess like trying to work out how you hold on to the things you think are really valuable, while also maybe trying to make some security. Because I think, without you don't want to exist in a kind of total world of precarity forever. And I think, I guess we've got things wrong, but I guess but as a culture of trying to change things and trying to look around and trying to hold on to a way of working that seems valuable, I guess not worry too much about trying to change things, I guess. And it does, at times it feels like you have moments in that you feel like completely out of control. And then it sort of clarifies for a bit, and then it sort of starts, falling apart a little bit, and then you have to like rechange it. And, we're sort of version 3, 4 at this stage, and probably into version 5 imminently.
It's a good question though, and I think that goes back to what you were saying, Ingrid, that we're so many different people, and I think me and Anthony represent, two people. I feel like everyone's felt quite differently about it, and I feel like I know some people felt like it was more of a revolution, and it was like the excitement of rebelling a bit or doing things differently, and like an idealism as well. Whereas I think others just enjoyed making things, or just kind of not worrying about being in an office and doing something beautiful and immediate. So I think it was like a mixture of that, but it was definitely a feeling of like play and fun and independence and like, trying stuff out that you haven't done before. A lot of the projects we've done are first of a kind. And it's like, it's not great for your financing model, but it's every time it's really fun. It's like, oh, we haven't done a gallery before, So I think that in itself is quite interesting, like a challenge, design challenge, and like research and reading books about whatever, fountains and stuff. So yeah. But no heads being cut, so it wasn't.
Yet.
Not yet.
Hiya. Is this? Yeah, okay. You said at the very start that opportunities these days are obviously different to when you first started out. But what would your message be to young architects and designers who seek that same level of being radical?
I think there are different opportunities. I guess, and I kind of alluded to the last question, it's like the benefit you have when you're young is that the risks are so much smaller. It's like, I guess in a way, like part of the thing that changes, like, and not keep harping on about kids, but like as you get older, your responsibilities change, and like suddenly not earning income is a big problem. And when you're young, that is really freeing. And so I guess the message personally I'd have would be like, take the risks when you're young, and there'll be niches and there'll be ways. I think it's more like a reflection on the type of thing that we used to do, and now I guess that comment was also about thinking about like, we have to change in a way, because the way we got work feels like it shifted quite drastically in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think maybe being self-critical, I think we were potentially slow to realise that, and now being like, okay, we actually need to really think about the way we do things. So I think there are opportunities, and I think the most important thing is like, take the risk when you can, in a way.
But just on that point, when you speak about the constraints of designing in the UK, for example, is that also a conscious decision of why your more recent and permanent buildings are sort of away from the UK?
I think it's to do with opportunities. I think ideally we'd love to work as close to where we are as possible, or obviously it's great. It's also amazing to be working abroad, but it's just the reality of the kinds of jobs we get and like where the funding is and who trusts us to do this kind of work or who's interested in that kind of work.
But I also think it's quite sad, like, if you think about, again, people like Serge and Bates, with the Fox Man, all of them, they didn't build in the UK for ages. They didn't get we don't support, I think this is a big conversation, we don't have an infrastructure that supports younger practice in the UK. Yeah. And we're talking to our peers, talking about people like Apparato, who did House for an Artist, they they're still like, we've done this amazing building and no one really, well, not no one, you know, like it's really hard to, even with that thing, it's really hard to break into worlds. And I think there's a real cultural problem about how we commission buildings in the UK. And I'm on the editorial board for the Flanders Architecture Review, and it's sort of really lovely and really depressing simultaneously, because there's like these buildings that, like, you know, you're looking at 10 schools, all of which are better than pretty much any school I've seen developed in the UK in the last 5 years. And you'll be like, oh, it's a bit average for Belgium, you know. And it's like there's a culture of making buildings, supporting architecture that Switzerland, I think, has it too. France, to some extent, that I guess, and I think we're in a world where, like, ultimately everything seems to be about fee, and as a result, actually, buildings are more expensive to build than most of Europe. You know, in Belgium, you can build a good building for 1,500 euros a square meter. Here, 3,000 absolute minimum. 4,000 maybe, if you've got any sort of ambition, you know, pounds. So we've got this structure that's an assumption that talks about, like, value that generates real mediocrity as a culture. And obviously there's some real exceptional people, they're great people working in the UK, but you can see that most people who are doing interesting stuff, who are like in their later careers now, they didn't get their breaks in the UK, and that's really sad. I'd much rather, in a way, it's nice doing some work abroad, but I'd like it if we could support architecture better here, personally.
I just wanted to jump in because I think the thing that you don't mention is this Cineronium was done as a year out side gig. So, and that's really important for anyone who's a student here, because, you know, that was something that people had jobs.
Yeah.
And nobody asked them to do that project. So I think, you know, really not. And so taking opportunity as a way of making further opportunity, I think, is really critical. I would love to have another conversation about the building industry, but
big
we
one.
should, I mean, because I'm on every day. Are there other?
So it was very inspiring. Thank you. I do have a question. Like, how did you reach to a point that you really have the framework to test new materials and their pigments and stuff like that? While today, I guess the material in most of the projects, architectural projects, is the last point of design where you reach with no money at all. So, like, how did you create this framework?
Yeah, I think it was the materials were always, that was the kind of only thing we really did in the beginning as materials. It's like the Cineronium was an industrial roofing material that was turned into a curtain. So in a way, it was always about that, kind of how do you create value from something that wasn't meant to be a thing, and you've kind of rethought it. And then I guess, yeah, with kind of more bougie projects where, you know, we're able to have a bit more fee, we're able to develop materials with more time and more expertise. But there's always still, like Anthony was saying, the kind of concrete tiles that we use for the facade and Goldsmiths. That was, again, rethinking of what's there. How do you make that a bit more interesting with a tight budget? So I think it's always there. It's just some things are more refined and more expensive. But yeah, I think it's always possible. You just have to kind of play and try stuff out. And it builds over time, you know.
But I think you're really good at finding beauty in things that other people think are ugly.
Yeah.
Valuing,
Yeah, and thinking about the offcuts and the waste, and I guess, yeah. I also think that the kind of building, like, the more kind of well-funded projects also enable you to prove things that you can then do in, like, you know, like more restricted contexts as well, to try and like build dialogue between those two things.
But yeah, it's like some of you probably make models using stuff you found in Skip. I don't know if AA does that, but you know, like cardboard to represent brick or whatever. You're always imagining things that aren't the thing itself. So you can kind of, that kind of continues, really, I guess.
That's a really good metaphor.
I went to the Venice Biennale earlier this summer, and the conversation had there, I don't know if it was a conversation, but there seemed to be two opinions about architecture's future materially. There's sort of one, an AI automated 3D printed material research, and then the other, a very crafts-based one. It seems to me, obviously, that you're more of the craft-based one. But if you were to have that conversation, what would you say to the other side? And have you tried to think of ways to invite that sort of way of thinking into your work?
I guess it's like we use modern tools, and I guess no, even like rapid prototyping. I think for me, it's like a lot of that way architecture is also it's a formal gesture that's talking about what it means to be AI architecture. That personally I don't subscribe to, but like the way we do things is entirely informed by like modern methods. I think. Interesting, a lot of the debate and a lot of the current conversation around natural materials actually is not just like using natural materials in really crafty ways. It's how you can use them to make kind of prefab units. And so currently working on like 2 houses that are straw prefab cassettes systems that then you can that to enable them to be built very cheaply for the scale they are. So I think it's about, I guess there's 2 things. I think that my beef with the kind of essentially like the color ratty world is it implies that you have to if you use the tech, you have this like sort of Baroque tech aesthetic, and if you want to do that, that's fine. Like I'm not critical of it as an approach. I guess the thing I find like contradictory is the idea that like somehow the tech leads to the form. Like people talk about like Zaha buildings are Maya buildings, right? It's like the tool. If you do like a D-sub, set of things, you end up with the shapes they get. That's fine. Again, it's not criticism, but like the idea that somehow that's a fundamental right way and the right angle is bad, just feels like odd. I think.
We're back to frocks.
Yeah, we're like confusing methods and aesthetic decisions. I guess it was just happening in architecture a lot of time. You look at all the functionalists, and weird, stupid things that like notionally are all about function that you're definitely not.
Really interesting question. This is like the conversational side of the room.
Maybe we should just all turn that way in.
Yeah.
Any questions from over here? No pressure, consultants from over here. But, any other questions? No, we're too shy. Well, I think we have drinks, actually perfect timing. And by all means, pick up a book, have a conversation with Anthony and Maria. I'm sure you have a lot of stories. But as you know, this really has been a tremendous pleasure. And I could ask you questions all night, but that would be greedy. And I want to thank you all for coming. And I hope that you go out and find your projects, do them without asking. And let's keep the conversation rich and perhaps make a little change, at least in this country, for the time being. Thank you so much.
Thank you.